Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's Greater Manchester press briefing. Apologies for the slightly late start today. On the call, I've got Baroness Beverly Hughes, who will update us in a moment on policing issues. Also pleased to welcome today our nighttime economy advisor, Sacha, who will respond to the Chancellor's statement yesterday. And then I will make some further comments towards the end, but we'll start just by taking you through the latest figures, as we always do. So if colleagues could put the first slide up. I think this slide will be familiar to you all. Because we've held the press briefing at the end this week, we've just added in a final column there, which updates the figures. Ooh, we could go back, sorry. Which updates the figures to the date that we would say is the last reliable date. So there's always a time that needs to be taken for the figures to settle, and that is from today, Monday's date. So you've got the figures there, colleagues, and they speak for themselves. 8 of our 10 authorities now over 100 cases per 100,000 as a rolling average. Bolton over 200, which is though pretty consistent from where they've been for the last 10 days or so. But obviously these are difficult figures for Greater Manchester, and we're working hard to bring them down. You'll see there as well, Wigan also having gone over 100 cases, and that's obviously a very big change in the borough from where we were a few weeks ago. So I'll go on, if I may, to the next slide. And we'd heard calls on the briefing before for more information on testing, and we wanted to give you this as the most complete picture we've been able to manage so far. And I think it tells a reasonably positive story with regard to the amount of testing that's been done. If you go back to the start of the period and look in the final column, Greater Manchester doing 1,233 tests on average. Now, I think that's per 100,000 population. I hope I'm right in saying that. It should have said that on the table, I think. I will correct that if that's not the case. And if you look now at the latest figure as of this time last week, that had significantly increased to 2,147. So I think, and to be fair, even though there were problems, very significant problems with testing in Greater Manchester last week, in that week ending the 19th of September, you will see that there were more tests carried out, to be fair to the government. But of course, what we didn't see was capacity that was anywhere close to the demand that we were experiencing on the system in that particular week. So those figures are revealing. If you look at the final line as well, and colleagues have asked us to give you more information on this, you'll see the positivity rate across the 10 boroughs and a Greater Manchester average, going from the lowest 3.2 in Stockport up to 8.4 in Bolton, but lots of other boroughs then in between. That's a high positivity rate, certainly for the boroughs over 5. That is a high rate, but we wanted you to have full transparency on those figures. If we might move on to the next slide. This is an ongoing major concern for us, the performance of NHS Test and Trace in Greater Manchester. We've touched on testing, but this of course is about the tracing, and particularly the tracing of the contacts of people testing positive. As you might expect, those numbers of contacts are increasing now every week as we see more positive cases. We expect that to continue increasing over the coming weeks, but so is the number of people not being reached. So it was 2,154 a week ago, and that's risen to 3,223, which represents a higher percentage as well. Not just more people, not just because there's more people, but there's a higher percentage of people not being reached. We have, as you know, you might remember last week we said that we were making available support from Greater Manchester Police and our fire service to support the effort to reach the contacts of positive people with a positive diagnosis and to improve the success rate of that contact tracing. Pleased to say that a huge amount of work has been going on over the last week, and we're grateful for support from NHS Test and Trace. Final tests are being done today, and we're hoping that that support service will go live early next week. So a really positive development, and of course I think we're the first part of the country to provide extra resources to support contact tracing in that way. If I might just turn to the final slide before I bring Bev in. Again, this was something that colleagues on the call wanted to see last week. We were unable to provide this for data issues, but pleased that we can provide this information to you this week. If you look at the figure for weekly admissions to hospital, what you will see is that the jump we saw in the early part of September is pretty much being sustained. So we're seeing hospital admissions at a significantly higher level, but at a sustained level. No spike in the last couple of weeks. So holding stable in the mid-30s there. But of course, that higher level of patients coming in on a cumulative basis is leading to more patients in hospital beds. So an increase this week in the number of people in ICU and also in non-ICU beds. But to put this in context, if you were to look at the figures at the peak of the first wave, we had 226 people in ICU beds across Greater Manchester and 1,047 patients in non-ICU beds. So that would be about 6 times higher than what we've currently got. So there's no complacency. The numbers are creeping up in terms of the numbers of patients in hospital, but it's happening in quite a steady way at the moment. And of course, we will continue to keep a close eye on that, as we will on our care homes, and you'll see those figures in the bottom left-hand corner. A small increase in the number of care home residents testing positive. Obviously, that's not something we want to see, but it is at a low rate, and we would obviously want to keep it there. So those are the figures, colleagues, giving you the overview of what's been going on in the last 7 to 10 days. And I will now hand over to Bev.
Thank you, Andy. I hope this is working, but my technology doesn't seem to be its normal self at the moment, but I guess you can hear me, so I'll carry on. I'd like to just touch over on how the situation has been since we had the last press conference in terms of enforcement activity. We talked about that last week. Progress on the joint partnership arrangements that we announced then to increase the emphasis on enforcement. What the response is going to be in terms of the additional measures, particularly the 10 p.m. closures. And then I want to say something about the challenges at the moment for the police service in terms of the levels of demand on them and what this actually means. So since the last press conference, over the past weekend and into this week, as you know, we were hoping to see that in the light of the high and rising levels of transmission and the fact that the government were indicating further measures would come into play, that we would see some abatement in the very high levels of large gatherings and other activity amongst a significant minority, albeit a minority of the population. And I'm afraid that has not happened. Activity over last weekend and into this week has continued at very similar levels that we've seen over recent weeks. Over 500 COVID reports to the police over last weekend, 350 house parties, street parties, birthday parties, and we factor into that now the social activities of students coming into the city region. 27 fixed penalty notices issued, 16 in fact at one event where people refused to disperse. and the police met a degree of obstruction. So whilst the majority of the public, as we know, are complying, there is a persistent and significant minority of people who aren't doing so. And at the moment, there's little indication, depressingly, that this behaviour is actually changing significantly for that group of people. In terms of the progress on the setting up of joint teams between the police and local authorities that we announced last week, beginning in Bolton, there are now locally based joint police and local authority teams in all 10 of our local authority areas. And they're identifying and responding to local intelligence as it emerges, undertaking local patrols, visiting licensed premises, and responding to other reports from the public. There's a central command function, an intelligence cell, and a radio dispatch team coordinating that activity. And that enables the flexible deployment of 2 police support units. One is based at the moment in Bolton, and the other is kept flexibly for deployment in response to events in any part of city region. And each of those units has 21 officers in it ready to support localities. So there's a considerable resource. That those units have been specially funded. Each of the 10 district patrols has also received additional funding from the police budget. In response to the additional measures, particularly the 10 p.m. Closure time for hospitality, it's too early at the moment to say quite how that's going to pan out. It's being watched very closely. We have already had to adapt the shift patterns, though, of our police officers and the teams in order to address what we expect to be a new peak around the 10 p.m. time each day now, not just at the weekends. And then just finally, just pulling all that together, I wanted to say something about the challenges through a combination of factors now on the police and on other partners too. And I do want to take this opportunity to thank police officers and police staff for the way they've actually responded to this incredible and increasing demand. And it's not just in terms of money, it's also an issue around the availability of officers and staff to continue to undertake overtime, which is what's been happening, to the levels that we've seen already. And that looks like that demand is going to continue and in fact potentially increase. And I am calling on the government today to come forward with additional funding and to recognise the combination of factors which together now challenge police ability to absorb all those additional demands. So in Greater Manchester, as you know, every weekend for the last 3 months, special operations have been stood up and they're carrying on, for which police officers' rest days and holidays have been cancelled. And on occasions, we've had to pay for mutual aid from other police services. And that has 2 effects. It's costing us between £70,000 and £100,000 every weekend for those operations. And there's also an intensity of the demands on our officers and on their families. Secondly, at the same time, in contrast to the start of the pandemic, when crime levels fell to between 25–30% lower than they normally are, crime levels across the board now have risen back to pre-COVID levels. And over recent weeks, you may have noticed there's been a spike in very serious crimes. We've had several murders, very serious violence cases, and rising levels of domestic violence too, creating that demand on the police. And then thirdly, of course, we're in a situation in which there's a rising rate of infection across the population, and the police are themselves not immune from that. So we've had 48 officers tested positive during September, and a further 300 are self-isolating now at home because they've been in contact either with their children who've tested positive or other family members. And then finally, the government has said it wants to see a surge in police visibility on the streets in order to enforce the 10 p.m. closure. And I have to say that the resources that we've got, both money and staff, are not infinitely elastic. And whilst the police are always prepared to do absolutely everything they can to respond to demands, I think the situation is such that we now need help from government to step up even further the response that they envisage. In GMP, the extent to which our officers can do even more overtime is limited, and we will have to seek mutual aid from other forces in order to put an extra presence of the police on the streets. And for that, we do need the government to come forward with some extra funding. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much indeed, Bev. So we'll go straight to Sacha for a response, particularly from our nighttime economy sector, to yesterday's announcements by the Chancellor. Sacha.
No, thanks, Andy. And, I think firstly, just to start by saying the whole of the hospitality industry absolutely get that safety has to come number one. We want to work alongside the government to make sure that we actually, we get this absolutely perfect. But we have to remember that many of our bars, restaurants, pubs have been shut for over 20 weeks, and they were just starting to feel some kind of normality, especially on the suburbs. And yesterday, what happened was a wielding blow to the whole of the industry. The curfew that they brought into place, there was some scepticism over that. There still is. We'll know the next few weeks whether that makes a difference or not. But in Greater Manchester alone, within the nighttime economy, we employ 420,000 people. It's the fifth biggest industry in the whole of the UK. So actually, back in March, when the Chancellor said that he'd stand and support business, yesterday he turned his back on especially venues that are still closed. Our theatres, our cultural organisations, our live music venues, our nightclubs, they are the bloodlines of the nighttime economy in Greater Manchester. Is what we're known for, it's what we're famous for. And, I've had so many freelancers. There are hundreds of thousands of freelancers, our techies, our lampies, our crew. They've had no financial support whatsoever since March. So, Andy, you and I spoke yesterday, and I think our intention is to actually get a section of people from across Greater Manchester who feel like the support is actually lacked now. They've had the rug pulled from them, and sit down, find out exactly what they need. I think I already know what they need, but go back to the government and ask them to revisit this, because they're actually about to kill the nighttime economy, and it's unprecedented. They're supporting other sectors, but why not the fifth biggest industry in the UK? And Bolton is the most perfect example. Without much warning at all, bars, restaurants, pubs have been shut in Bolton for 4 to 5 weeks, and actually they turned around and said, well, we'll support you with £500 a week. And actually it's quite insulting. £500 a week for a business is not even going to touch the sides. So I'd like to think that the work we can do now in Greater Manchester, alongside yourself, Andy, and colleagues in the Combined Authority, we can actually set a precedent for the city region and be one of the first ones in the UK to do this, and actually go back to the government and show them what they need to do.
Thanks very much, Sacha, and thanks, Bev. As you can see from the figures, colleagues, and figures we've shown you all year, we've been grappling with the health crisis in recent weeks, but it does now feel like the economic crisis is going to break on us on top of that, given everything that Sacha has just said. Now, we understand the constraints under which the government is working. It's a difficult situation, but the logic of kind of keeping people's jobs going through this so that we could come back strongly once we'd found a vaccine was good, but has now been discontinued, it seems to us. It was an underwhelming package from the Chancellor yesterday, and it won't prevent now a wave of redundancies across Greater Manchester through the autumn and into the winter. If I may just pick out 3 things that I think were missing or were wrong with the Chancellor's package. The first is, a lot of people have pointed this out, but it's certainly the analysis of people within my team saying that it might actually incentivise redundancies, in that it might incentivise employers to employ one person full time, as opposed to employing 2 or 3 part time. And it's actually possibly only a narrow kind of set of circumstances in which employers would take advantage of the Chancellor's scheme. If they can see a clear path to returning, then perhaps it might work for them. But for those who can't see that, then it would appear that it doesn't. So that brings me to the second problem, and Sacha's articulated this very clearly, but let me add another sector, aviation. You know, all of these sectors that can't see any meaningful return anytime soon can't bring back people on a partial basis. And this is then serious for the Greater Manchester economy, because we have a significant reliance on industries that are in very much limbo at the moment. So aviation and all of the supporting industries linked to it, for one, but of course live events, tourism, live music, all of the things that Sacha was talking about. You know, this scheme does not help them, and there are many people here, particularly freelancers, as Sacha has said, who've been forgotten. But also there is that issue of the company directors, who often are reasonably middle to low paid as well, who've had no support since March. And I think, you know, they were holding out hope that this package would have delivered something for them, and the fact that it hasn't, I think now we'll see a real loss of optimism, if you like, and a real then effect on people's jobs and their ability to keep going. But then the third problem is this lack of support for areas under restrictions. And this is the issue I just want to kind of emphasise and finish on today. Sacha's mentioned Bolton. It's just not acceptable to me that businesses can be closed overnight by the government, but then only a paltry amount of funding being made available to them. And I know there are businesses in Bolton who just feel completely forgotten here, had their livelihoods taken away from them at a stroke, but without any meaningful compensation. It just isn't right. We'd made a pitch this week to the government for Bolton to come into line with the national curfew, and it's disappointing that that's not been accepted. But actually, to make the wider point, you know, there's a huge area here in Greater Manchester that's been under restrictions for a long time now, and those restrictions limit the extent to which people can socialise both in the home and in enclosed settings. And of course, that has an ongoing impact on industry and hospitality that's over and above what is experienced in other parts of the country when it's only the national restrictions that are in place. Now, we understand the government will be announcing further changes to the Greater Manchester restrictions later today, and it's not for me to comment on that. We, of course, have been in discussions with them. But one thing I wanted to reference today is the suggestion in the papers that the government is now to move to a tiering scheme where Tier 1 will be national restrictions only, Tier 2 will be places that have additional restrictions, and I think that would mean including Greater Manchester, and then Tier 3 lockdown situation. Let me just say something about that. You know, there are doubts here about the extent to which the restrictions have been effective. I think at best we can say they've probably stopped the growth in cases that we might otherwise have seen. But the patchwork nature of these restrictions, the confusion that there is amongst the public, and particularly the confusion now in terms of how they relate to what was announced by the Prime Minister earlier this week, I think is diminishing any remaining effectiveness that they have. But the crucial point I want to raise is if the government is going to move to a tiering system where it looks like they will be setting these restrictions in place for the foreseeable future, it is got to be set out as a principle alongside that any area that is under those extra restrictions beyond the national Tier 1 restrictions, it must follow that those areas receive financial support. So now about half of the population of the north of England is under some form of restrictions, and this is where these local restrictions are largely being used. As I understand it, no council south of Solihull is under any form of restrictions, and these restrictions in our case have been in place for a number of weeks now, getting on for 7 to 8 weeks in place, and they are having an impact on people's lives, but also people's jobs and people's businesses. And as we've heard from Sacha, there was not any compensatory support for many of those people announced yesterday. And I think this is an unacceptable situation. And I need to make that very clear today. And I need to point that out to the government. We are being levelled down, not up. And this can't continue, because if it does, it will make the recovery so much harder in Greater Manchester. Restrictions must come with support, and that has to be a principle that is firmly established before we go any much further forward. So that will be the clear message that we will be giving to the government as we go towards this new tiering system that is being proposed. Absolutely, Bolton should be receiving support today for all of those businesses that are affected, but particularly the individuals that are affected too. When we went back to the summer, when the R number in the Northwest first went over 1, I said that day, alongside the Mayor of the Liverpool City region, that there should be a local furlough. If any businesses are closed, the people who work in those businesses should immediately be able to access a local furlough scheme. But here we are, we've had pubs, restaurants shut in Bolton for the last couple of weeks, and people basically put out of work overnight. That it cannot be accepted as in any way right and proper. It is an absolute betrayal of those places that the government said that it would level up. And as I say, it can't stand. And it's not just the people who work in bars and restaurants, it's the people who work in the taxi trade who service those establishments and all of the knock-on industries as well. So as I say, the north of England under restrictions without support is being levelled down. And that, I'm afraid, directly breaks the government's election promise, and it needs to be corrected, and it needs to be corrected right away. So I'll leave it there, Ross, and I will hand back to you to take us through the questions that colleagues have put forward. Ross.
Thanks very much. We've got quite a number of questions, so I'm going to try and group them. I also know Bev's having a couple of technical issues, so if I need to read the question again, I'm more than happy to do that. But I'm going to take a round of 3. First question from Nick Statham. Question for you, Andy. He understands that Stockport was against household restrictions being imposed, given its infection rate is below the GM and Northwest average. We've also seen infection rates rise across the board since GM lockdown was announced at the end of July, bringing the rationale behind it into question. Do you support the government's decision to reintroduce restrictions in Stockport, and if so, on what grounds? I'm also going to take Jess Forbes, who's got a similar question at 131. We've had GM restrictions for about 2 months now, and really strict ones in the cases of Oldham and Bolton for 2 weeks. Cases haven't come down, they've spread without evidence that the measures are improving the situation. How can we expect people to keep tolerating limits to their freedom and ability to make money? And one final one on the same
Ross, I'll take 2, otherwise I won't. Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much, Nick, and thank you, Jess. The government hasn't announced its decision in respect of Stockport, Nick. So obviously, I probably better not comment on that for now. But let me just make some general points. I mean, I understand what's being said about the effectiveness of restrictions, and these are concerns that you've heard Greater Manchester leaders voice. I think there was evidence that they were effective in the early days in terms of dampening the increases that we were seeing, and in some cases reversing them. I think that the best thing you could say now is that perhaps we would have seen greater growth in our numbers had those restrictions not been in place. So I wouldn't say that they are completely ineffective, but I think what we do see is limited effectiveness, which probably diminishes over time, and particularly where there is divergence between one place and another, where the confusion increases amongst the public. So I would say to the government that they really do need to review this strategy, and the tiering system, we would say, needs to take on board concerns that the Greater Manchester leaders are expressing. If it is concluded that restrictions are needed, or tougher restrictions, it has to be a principle, as I said a moment ago, that comes with additional support for those areas affected. So these restrictions are almost becoming the only tool we're using, and this is the main point I would want to make to both of you. You know, they've got to be just sort of a fallback, if you like, for the failure of other policies, and particularly I'm thinking about test and trace. This is where our attention should be, and I say it again, NHS test and trace is not working properly in Greater Manchester, and it's certainly not working properly when it comes to contact tracing. We see today in the news nationally that only 11% of people are self-isolating when requested to do so by NHS test and trace. My suspicion is that might be even lower in Greater Manchester. This is nowhere near good enough. And it can't be the case that it's restrictions alone that are being used to try and control the virus, because if we try that, then I'm afraid we will be overtaken by this. Fixing test and trace is the answer, not loading more and more restrictions on local authorities. So, you know, in terms of the case numbers that we have at the moment, it's difficult to argue against measures that will obviously seek to try and bring those numbers under control. I think it's difficult to argue against a consistent approach across Greater Manchester, given the position that we are now in, but there is a limit to what any restrictions like this can achieve, and we believe the government would be much better focusing on fixing NHS test and trace.
Thanks, Andy. One from Niall. Last week, when it was asked of you how you felt about the school situation, you said that it was still safe to keep them open, but to ask you again in a week. So Niall is now doing so. A week's passed and now a fifth of schools in Greater Manchester sent children home. Some have even closed their doors entirely and thousands of people are self-isolating. Where do you stand on this now?
It's a good question, Niall, and I'm glad I did ask you to ask me again in a week, because obviously you kind of learn more with every week that passes. I think that's what's certainly true about the situation that we're in. You can't always stay in the same position all of the time. I've now had some family experience of this issue as well, but I would come back to it in saying that we should keep schools open. What I think might be needed is a review of the guidance about how schools are operating. In my experience, it can be the case that where there's just one instance within a year group, that the whole year is sent home, and that can lead then obviously to kids within that year having a prolonged period off school. Now, you know, it might be that children are being sent home and they had no contact with the case that was testing, the person that was testing positive. So I think that seems to me to be a highly cautious approach that is making schooling very, very difficult. And it could mean that we see large numbers of students spending a large amount of time out of school in their, in my case, in my family case, GCSE year, and that can't be right. So I think what we're going to need here is some review of the way this is being implemented by schools. And I think particularly there's an issue here for GCSEs and A levels. I think the conversation needs to start now about what allowances are going to be made for young people who may face significant kind of weeks out of college or school this year as they're building towards exams. And I think we need to have clarity so that we don't end up in the chaos that we saw in the summer just gone.
Thanks, Andy. Two questions for you, and I think we'd probably want to bring Sacha in after as well. Katie from That's Manchester at 134 asks, a number of businesses in Bolton say they feel ignored. One pub owner she spoke to this morning, who doesn't have the facilities to provide takeout options, says he feels left in the dark since Bolton restrictions became tighter and he wants better and more communication. Do you have a message to business owners like him? And Chris, just underneath the Bolton news, Bolton's pub and restaurant sector have been left high and dry by the latest restrictions. Will you push for an equalisation for the Bolton hospitality sector with the rest of GM in the near future?
Well, thanks, Katie. Thanks, Chris. And I'm sure Sacha will want to comment. Do I have a message? Well, I understand how they feel. And actually, I have made direct representations to the government this week to ask that hospitality within Bolton is brought into line with the national curfew. We can't justify, well, to be honest with you, I was taken by surprise by this measure in the first place. We always had our doubts about closing pubs in one borough alone, when people in Bolton can simply walk across, in some cases, the border down a few streets and go into pubs in a neighbouring borough. So we were never convinced that this measure would have a huge impact, and we always thought it might be create more harm than good, if you like, in the way in which it was implemented. So I do understand how they feel. We're not neglecting you, I can assure you of that. I have made direct representations to the government this week on Chris's point to allow Bolton businesses to come into line with the national curfew, recognising that some can't do takeaway, as Katie's question said, and we will continue to make that strong appeal that this restriction be lifted. To close businesses down without giving them proper support, I'll come back to it, is immoral in my view, and it can't be allowed to go unchallenged, and we won't leave it unchallenged. Sacha, anything you would like to add?
No, certainly. So I echo everything you just said, Andy. But you know, Katie's point, at the moment, the hospitality industry is on its knees. To now spend more money to try and put in a takeaway service is completely unacceptable. People can't afford that. But Chris, you mentioned pubs as well. And actually, on the back of yesterday, I am extremely fearful that this could be the end of what we in Greater Manchester call the backstreet boozer. You know, this VAT reduction from 20% down to 5% does help restaurants, but actually those backstreet pubs that don't serve food, that are just wet-led, alcohol-led, there's no help with them whatsoever. So actually that plus the curfew could be, you know, we could see many, many doors shutting.
Thanks, Sacha. Give me 1 second. I'm going to go to Kath from BBC Northwest Tonight at 1:31. She's asking quite a specific question at the start, which is what is the age range of the COVID hospital admissions and those patients in ICU? She goes on to say the Northwest has by far the highest infection rate in the country. A number of scientists have been in the media this week saying that the only measure that will now stop this increase is a full social lockdown, so no households would be able to meet each other at all. Would you like to see this across Greater Manchester and across the Northwest as a whole, and for how long?
So, Kath, on the first part of your question, I don't think we are able to give you that information. The figures we've given are probably all we can give you. There is obviously confidentiality issues with giving age breakdowns, particularly as they relate to individual hospitals. So I don't think we are in a position to give you that information. But you're right to say, of course, that the country, and particularly the Northwest, faces a really challenging situation, and I think, you know, our friends in Liverpool are higher than any Greater Manchester boroughs now, regrettable to say, but we understand that the numbers there are increasing further still. So the Northwest does face a really challenging situation, but I think we need to keep a degree of proportionality here. You know, if we look at the numbers that are going into hospital, or the numbers in care homes, I don't think it is a case at this stage that we have to resort to a full lockdown of the kind that you were saying. As the government has said, you can't rule that out later down the line. But I think at this stage, the focus should be on encouraging people to follow the guidance, taking targeted action where we need to, targeted enforcement, but fixing test and trace. This is the thing that, you know, let's not always sort of see restrictions as the only way. The pressure has got to be applied here to fix test and trace. You know, that is meant to be stopping the restrictions of the kind that we're seeing, and other countries seem to be managing it. So why can't we? As I say, we put forward a constructive offer from Greater Manchester. We hope that will start very soon. But fixing test and trace has to be more of a priority, it seems to me, than just loading more and more restrictions on. And just to make one final comment about the Northwest, it seems to me, when you look at now what's happening in Greater Manchester, the Liverpool City region, parts of Lancashire, you know, it's really clear to me that when we go back to when national lockdown was originally released, it was too early for the northwest of England. I said it at the time. I'm going to say it again now. It was a decision taken more with London in mind than with the northwest in mind. And the failure to represent all parts of England on Cobra, I think, has been a mistake. It remains a mistake, because that is the point that we would have made. And now to have the north under a patchwork of local restrictions is really hard for people here, particularly when we would say more caution should have been taken before it came to lifting lockdown when cases were still quite high. What is indefensible is leaving the communities of the northwest in this position without providing that extra financial support, because, as I said, we're being levelled down, not levelled up. So I personally, Kath, would not go at this point in time to a full social lockdown, as the way you put it. I would be really reluctant to see that done on a localised basis, given our experience over recent weeks. And if it is to be done, it has to be done with full financial support, and I would say on a national basis. I think the Chancellor missed a big opportunity yesterday to keep the financial support in place, as other countries have left in place, to support people through the autumn and winter. The economies of the northwest are already more fragile than other parts of the country, and they are now under sustained pressure without the support that they need. And I think we do have to bear that in mind before we talk of further restrictions or lockdown.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to go to Rowan Bridge, Radio 5 Live, 137. Given the current extra restrictions have failed to bring down cases and the trend is still in the wrong direction, what do you believe will be necessary to actually improve the situation? You've made it clear people need to be paid more to self-isolate, but beyond that, what else is going to work when people have become tired of these measures they're currently living under? And also a very short question from Rachel Lazaro at BBC News Online. You've touched on this before, and obviously we're waiting a government announcement, but do you support reimposing household restrictions in Stockport and Wigan?
Well, thanks, Rowan, for your question. And you know, I would say that, you know, relying solely on restrictions, as I said before, is never likely to work, particularly when they're localised, because you don't get the impact of national measures. So they have an impact, but I think it's a limited impact, and relying on them to completely turn the figures around, I think is not going to work. I think the kindest way you could describe it is that they probably stopped what might have been extra growth in the figures, but that is probably, I think, all that you could say that they might be achieving at this particular moment in time. What more needs to be done to improve the situation? Well, to be fair, the government finally did listen to our calls to provide financial support for people to self-isolate. We wait for the details of that scheme, but that is certainly a major step forward. You say, what else? Well, it's just simple. It's test and trace. It's just not working still. And, you know, we could go off and try and find a million other things to try and help, but actually these are the core things that we're being told will help. And they are not working to anywhere like the level we need them to be working. And I particularly reference contact tracing within that. We need a wholesale change here. So what we've been doing is not working. And what's the old definition of insanity? Well, we know what that is, carrying on doing the same thing. So a change is needed. And I'm really convinced that there needs to be a major change ahead of the winter. And that is to take resource out of a system at a national level that isn't working. And we read that that's now risen to £12 billion in the Chancellor's statement yesterday. It is not delivering the results, quite simply. So that money now needs to be redirected to the teams on the ground in districts like Greater Manchester, but across the country, so that we have people in communities doing that testing and that contact tracing. For me, that is the only hope that we've got of rescuing this system ahead of the winter. There has to be a major transfer of resource out of these national contracts and in to local teams, and it needs to happen immediately. And I hope I've answered your question. The second question, Ross, was from Rachel. It's a difficult situation, Rachel, and as I say, we don't know the government's decision yet. But on the basis of the figures that we have, particularly for Wigan, it's hard to say that that nothing should be done, particularly when neighbouring authorities have lower numbers of cases, but are then in restrictions. So I think there is an anomaly there. But the question is, what's the future of these restrictions more generally? That's, I think, the question that the government needs to answer. It's clear that something needs to be done to stop the growth in cases, certainly in Wigan and to a lesser extent Stockport. But this can't be the only answer, because as we've been discussing today, those restrictions are not bringing about the level of change that we need to see if we're to avoid the trajectory that France and Spain have been on in recent weeks.
Thanks, Andy. Stephen Kingston at the Salford Star has asked if you could give us an update on the 100 billion saliva moonshot testing that is being trialled in Salford. They've run a story this morning on the government possibly being taken to court about the transparency in relation to these contracts and the methods by a group of lawyers and doctors who state that the technology doesn't exist for such mass testing. He's just asking if you're able to comment on that at all.
I'll be honest, Stephen, not much really. I honestly don't know a great deal about this programme. So I have concerns more broadly about the way these contracts during this period are being handed out, and the lack of transparency. But I couldn't, in all honesty, give you a very direct answer to your question, because I simply don't know enough about it. I'm just giving you an honest answer.
Thanks, Andy. One from Charlotte Wace at the Times. I think you probably want to bring Sacha in on as well. At 1:49, some owners of hospitality businesses in Bolton have claimed residents are simply going outside of the borough to visit restaurants and pubs. As a result, some feel that it is unfair that they have to remain closed. Is this a concern, and if so, how can it be addressed?
Well, let me just try to answer that briefly, Ross. I think I've touched on this already, but Charlotte, absolutely. It's a completely legitimate concern in my view, and it was always the issue with any localised closure in Greater Manchester, because it's an interconnected place, and we've always made this point. People don't live their lives completely within one set of borough boundaries. They cross those boundaries every single day, and simply to have pubs closed in one area, it might actually mean that you encourage people to travel around from the area that has the highest number of cases. So we've never been convinced of the logic of doing this. We're certainly not convinced of the logic, well, not the logic, the fairness of doing it with no financial support for those businesses. I understand just how frustrated they must feel today. We did make a direct appeal for them. Just let me be clear about this. We made a direct pitch to the government this week to say, please align Bolton with the national curfew. As I understand it, that is not going to be granted. I might just say, Ross, we will continue to make that appeal until this issue is resolved.
Thanks, Andrew. Bring in Sacha on that point as well.
No, I completely agree with Andy, Charlotte. I mean, we've seen it on the TV, we've seen it on the news, incidents where someone has to have a pub shut in Bolton, and then literally 2 minutes away, there's another pub just on the other side of the border that's double as busy than it normally is. So in effect, for me, it's spreading the virus. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I completely sympathise with the operators in Bolton. It's not fair, and it was an ill thought out concept. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks, Sacha. Andy, Adam Clark at Roch Valley Radio, 2 quick questions. Clubs at steps 3 to 6 of non-league football have allowed fans in stadiums for a number of weeks now. With the rising levels of infections across GM, do you feel it's still safe for fans to attend those games? And do you think that shop owners and workers should be allowed to be more forceful with rules surrounding wearing face masks? If so, do you think this could prevent the chances of tighter local lockdowns?
Thanks, Adam. I understand the desire to get fans back in grounds, but I think there is a need for caution here. I know that plans have been put on hold at Premier League and League One level, but I think there's a need for caution in the lower leagues. Obviously. It might be easier for people to keep a distance at grounds without all of the seating, so people can move around more freely. But still, I think I would say we need to err on the side of caution. But on the other side of that, I would also say the time has come for a football rescue package, and I'm particularly looking in the direction of the Premier League when I say that, because I think the onus is on the top of the game now to support clubs who are really going to struggle through the coming months because of the restrictions that there will be on the number of fans coming back into grounds. And I think, if I were the government, I'd be saying to the Premier League and the FA that they need to come forward with some funding that perhaps the government could increase, but we need a football rescue package here. Otherwise, we're going to see clubs one after another fall like dominoes. Wigan are obviously having a really tough time at the moment, but there's a number of clubs right behind them in Greater Manchester, Football League clubs as well as non-league clubs, who might find it too difficult to survive in the current climate. And this is the thing, isn't it? Sacha was mentioning theatre, music before. It's the same with football and rugby league, isn't it? What's it going to feel like if we get through this virus and then we look around and all the things we care about have been decimated and are gone? It's not going to feel like it was all worth it, is it? Some things are worth saving, and it's people's businesses and jobs, of course, but it's also the things we care about, like football clubs, rugby league clubs, theatres, venues. This infrastructure matters, and I just think the government's going to have to take a different approach here, as other countries have taken, and support the cultural and sporting infrastructure of the country. On the second question, I think it's a very strong concern that keeps being expressed by the 10 leaders of Greater Manchester, that particularly our larger supermarkets are not doing enough here. And it's important for me to reiterate this again today. It's certainly the feeling of Greater Manchester Police. There's not enough being done to enforce the wearing of face coverings within supermarkets and shops. And it's not, for me, an issue for checkout staff or staff working within the supermarket. The supermarkets have made enough money this year to employ more store security staff at the front door, saying that people can't be allowed to enter unless they're wearing a face covering. Because the important point here is it's unfair on more vulnerable shoppers who are worried about going out if they then see people in shops without face coverings or masks. So that's we've raised this with the supermarkets. We don't think we've had an adequate response. They all should be providing face masks or support for people going into the store. And let me just be really clear about that. £5 for a packet of 5 face masks seems to me to be excessive in this current climate. So I think they both need to review their entrance policy, more store security in store to manage both the wearing of masks and distancing. And I would ask them to review some of the pricing policies that they have for paper masks, as they seem way too high to me at the moment.
Thanks, Andy. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So Jennifer Williams at the MEN asks about care home visits. They've had absolutely heartbreaking stories of people unable to visit distressed relatives in care homes, even wearing full PPE. What's your position on this? Previously, you'd promised to take on the issue where people with dementia are concerned. Do you think the balance is currently correct?
It's a really important question, Jem, because I know just how devastating this is for thousands of people and families who are separated from loved ones. You know, it's really is heartbreaking, as you say, and we recognise that. All the leaders recognise that. It's why we asked our own public health teams and our directors of adult services to review this issue, and they have been reviewing it. It's one of those where there are just two sort of equally valid concerns. On the one hand, wanting to allow family contact and all of the emotional benefits that will bring, but on another, not allowing a repeat of what we saw in care homes in the earlier part of this year. And these two things, you know, we're kind of wrestling with these two things. All I can say to you today is we're trying to find the balance that you're looking for. I personally don't think it is correct at the moment. I think there has to be some ability for families to be reunited. And that's what we've asked our teams to see if we can find, you know, what are the kind of the grounds and the exceptional circumstances in which we can allow this to happen. Could it be that each family could nominate one person to become part of the testing regime of a particular care home? That's one option. Have we got the capacity to do that is another question. It's really fraught with difficulties, but can I just say that we absolutely recognise the question, and I think the Greater Manchester Emergency Committee will receive a sort of, we had a paper on it a couple of weeks ago, more work is being done. I hope we're going to see updated proposals on this next week or the week after, and of course we'll keep you posted on that.
Thanks, Andy. Final question from Tom Dambach at Hits Radio. They've spoken to a wedding venue in Bolton who's in tears about the new restrictions of 15 guests from Monday. They're struggling financially and are calling on the government for more support. Do you believe, do you support these restrictions, or do you believe we could follow Northern Ireland in allowing venues to risk assess how many guests they can safely hold? Well,
thanks very much, Tom. Again, I think it's one of those things that people are left scratching their head a bit when we see, you know, the numbers allowed for funerals, but not for weddings. It's difficult, isn't it? It's going to just be one of those where there's no right or wrong answer. You can understand why the government are wanting to restrict gatherings, particularly weddings, where, you know, there can be a lot of mingling of people from different parts of the country, and I can understand why they are wary about that. On the other hand, you know, to do what Northern Ireland are doing and saying, you know, as many as can safely be held, well, yeah, I'm not sure that the government will see that as something that we could readily embrace at the moment. I think this is where it comes down to the kind of recurrent theme of today. If there are going to be restrictions that damage businesses in a very significant way, there has to be compensation and a support package. It really is as simple as that, because as Sacha was saying, you know, how many businesses, how many jobs are we going to lose? And how much harder is the recovery going to be when we get through this? So, you know, I think it defeats the object of what the Treasury did with the furlough scheme to sort of pull all of that support in too soon, because you kept businesses going for half of the year, the 6 months that we've been in these measures, and then you sort of pull it away before we're through and hopefully at the other side with the vaccine. So I'm struggling to see the logic of what the government is doing, and you know, if we can't support businesses by being more relaxed with the regulations, it's got to be a principle that then those businesses qualify for more support. So Ross, I think that's all of the questions for today, is it? And that brings us to our hour just about, doesn't it? Thanks everybody for your questions. I think we are expecting an announcement from the government, and sorry I can't preempt that this afternoon, but obviously we will wait to see what the government says. But we will be putting in further representations to the government on the issues that I've mentioned today as they're working towards this tiering proposal that we are hearing about, and we will be updating you more on that next week. But I think we've probably covered, Ross, everything that we need to today. Big thanks to Sacha for coming and providing such a passionate and strong voice for our nighttime economy. Honestly, Sacha, for people who are struggling right now, I think they really will appreciate you talking in the very direct way that you did for them, and that's just what they need right now. So thanks so much, Sacha, for coming, and sorry that Bev had technical difficulties, but thanks so much to Bev as well, and for all of you for joining us and for continuing to inform our residents through these challenging times. So have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you all next week. Thank you.